The inheritance seemed unfair. One brother took the John Deere, the other got their father's old Farmall. Then, a hidden truth changed everything. Marcus Williams pulled the tarp off what everyone considered the crown jewel of his father's estate, a pristine 1985 John Deere 4050 with barely 3,000 hours on the clock, gleaming green and yellow paint that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor 40 years ago. Meanwhile, his younger brother Danny was in the far corner of the barn, staring at the oil-stained concrete where their father's beat-up 1952 Farmall Super C had sat for the past 3 decades. Its red paint faded to rust, its engine held together with baling wire and prayer. "I can't believe Dad did this to us," Danny muttered, watching Marcus run his hands lovingly over the John Deere's spotless fenders. 35 years working this farm side by side, and he leaves you the tractor that's worth more than my house while I get the museum piece that barely runs. But what neither brother knew, what their father had kept secret for over 70 years, was that the worthless Farmall sitting in that corner wasn't just any Super C. It was the same tractor that had saved their grandfather's farm during the Great Depression, had been lovingly restored by Henry Ford's personal mechanic in 1953, and contained a hidden modification that made it one of only 12 tractors like it in the entire world. Subscribe, hit that like button, and settle in, because this story of sibling rivalry, family secrets, and the hidden value of things we overlook will completely change how you think about inheritance, legacy, and the true worth of the machines that built American agriculture. The reading of William Bill Williams' will had taken place on a gray October morning in 2019, exactly 1 week after the 73-year-old patriarch of Williams Farms had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The family lawyer, Harold Peterson, had gathered Marcus, Danny, and their mother Ruth in the small conference room above the bank in Millerville, Iowa, to settle the estate of a man who had farmed 800 acres for over 50 years. Most of the inheritance had been divided logically and fairly. The farmland itself would go to Marcus, the older brother at 41, who had worked alongside his father managing the operation for the past 15 years. Danny, 38 and more interested in the mechanical side of farming, would inherit the shop, the equipment barn, and all the tools and machinery necessary to continue servicing not just Williams Farms, but the dozen other operations in the county that relied on Danny's expertise with vintage farm equipment. It was the tractors that had caused the tension. Bill Williams had been a collector, though he'd never called himself that. Over 5 decades of farming, he'd accumulated an impressive array of agricultural machinery, from a 1947 Alice Chalmers WC to a nearly new 2018 Case IH Magnum. But 2 tractors stood out from the collection, and they couldn't have been more different. The first was the 1985 John Deere 4050, a machine that represented the pinnacle of 1980s agricultural technology. With its 130 horsepower engine, synchronized transmission, and sound guard cab, it had been Bill's pride and joy for over 30 years. He'd bought it new in 1985 for $48,000, a fortune at the time, and had maintained it with obsessive care. The odometer showed just 2,147 hours, and every system functioned as perfectly as the day it left the Waterloo plant. The second tractor was a 1952 Farmall Super C, a compact utility tractor that had been old when Bill acquired it in the early 1970s. Where the John Deere gleamed with pristine paint and polished chrome, the Farmall showed every one of its 67 years. The red paint had faded and chipped, the seat was cracked and patched with duct tape, and the engine leaked enough oil to leave a permanent stain wherever it was parked. According to the will, Marcus would inherit the John Deere. Danny would get the Farmall. "I don't understand Dad's reasoning on this," Marcus had said after the lawyer finished reading. "The John Deere is worth at least $30,000. That old Farmall might bring $3,000 at auction, and that's only if someone wants it for parts." Danny had tried to hide his disappointment, but it was clear he felt slighted by their father's decision. While he appreciated vintage machinery and understood the historical significance of the old international harvester models, he also recognized that the John Deere represented real value, the kind of asset that could be sold to invest in his shop or used as collateral for business expansion. "Maybe Dad figured you needed the John Deere more than I did," Danny had said diplomatically, though his voice carried undertones of hurt. "Lord knows that Farmall has given me more grief than help over the years." Ruth Williams had remained silent during her son's discussion, but those close to the family noticed something strange about her reaction to the tractor inheritance. Rather than seeming surprised by her late husband's decision, she appeared almost expectant, as if waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. "Boys," she had said finally, "your father was many things, but he wasn't unfair. If he left you those specific tractors, he had his reasons." But neither Marcus nor Danny could see any logic in those reasons. The disparity in the inheritance became even more apparent when the brothers took possession of their respective machines. Marcus's John Deere started instantly, its diesel engine purring with the smooth confidence of a machine that had been properly maintained for nearly 4 decades. Every gauge worked, every hydraulic system responded precisely, and the transmission shifted as smoothly as the day it was manufactured. It was, by any measure, a piece of agricultural machinery in exceptional condition. Danny's Farmall, on the other hand, required 20 minutes of preparation before it would even turn over. The carburetor needed priming, the choke had to be set just right, and the starting procedure involved a precise sequence of actions that Danny had memorized through years of frustration. Once running, the engine ran rough, the hydraulics were weak, and the steering required constant correction. "This is exactly what I expected," Danny told his wife Sarah that evening. "Dad leaves Marcus a tractor that could work for another 30 years, and I get one that should have been retired during the Reagan administration." But Danny was wrong about his father's motivations, and he was wrong about his tractor's history. The truth about the Farmall Super C began with a story that had been passed down through 3 generations of Williams men, though its significance had been forgotten over the decades. In 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, Danny's grandfather, Thomas Williams, had been on the verge of losing the family farm. Crop prices had collapsed, banks were calling in loans, and farmers throughout Iowa were walking away from land their families had worked for generations. Thomas needed a tractor to help harvest what might be his final crop, but new equipment was impossible to afford, and quality used machinery was scarce. That's when Thomas Williams made a desperate deal with Earl Hendricks, a machinery dealer in Cedar Rapids, who had taken possession of a repossessed 1932 Farmall F12 from another farmer's bankruptcy. The tractor was in rough condition, having been worked hard and maintained poorly, but it was all Thomas could afford with his last $150. "Take it or leave it," Hendricks had told him, "but I'll tell you something about this machine that might interest you. It used to belong to a man named Robert Schultz, and Schultz had some connections you might find useful." What Hendricks hadn't mentioned was that Robert Schultz had been more than just another failed farmer. Schultz had been a mechanic at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, before returning to Iowa to try farming. When his agricultural venture failed, he'd sold his equipment to pay debts, but not before making some modifications to his Farmall that reflected his expertise in automotive engineering. Thomas Williams had no way of knowing that the beaten-up tractor he'd purchased had been the subject of extensive mechanical experimentation by a man who understood internal combustion engines better than almost anyone in the Midwest. The Farmall helped Thomas harvest his 1933 crop, and that harvest, combined with a small upturn in grain prices, provided just enough income to keep the farm through the worst years of the Depression. Thomas used that tractor for the next 15 years, eventually trading it for a newer model in 1948, when the post-war economic boom made equipment upgrades possible. The Farmall disappeared into the agricultural equipment market, changing hands several times over the following decades. It was purchased by a succession of small farmers, each of whom used it for a few years before upgrading to something newer or more powerful. In 1971, the tractor reappeared at an equipment auction in Decorah, Iowa. By then, it had accumulated thousands of hours and countless modifications, repairs, and temporary fixes. The red paint had faded, the sheet metal showed dents and rust spots, and the engine had been rebuilt at least twice with whatever parts were available. Bill Williams was at that auction looking for a utility tractor to handle odd jobs around his expanding farm operation. He wasn't interested in anything fancy or expensive, just a reliable machine that could pull a mower, run a hay rake, or power a grain auger when his newer tractors were busy with more demanding tasks. When the auctioneer called for bids on Lot 47, a 1952 Farmall Super C runs but needs work, Bill raised his hand at $800. No one else bid. Bill had no idea that he'd just repurchased the same tractor that had helped save his father's farm nearly 40 years earlier. The Farmall had been rebuilt and upgraded so many times that its original serial number was obscured, and its connection to the Williams family history had been lost in the chaos of the agricultural equipment market. For the next 48 years, the Farmall served as Bill Williams' utility tractor, handling the hundreds of small tasks that kept a diversified farming operation running. It wasn't glamorous work, mowing ditches, cleaning out cattle lots, pulling equipment to remote fields. But the old tractor performed those duties with the steady reliability that had characterized Farmall tractors since the 1920s. What Bill Williams never discovered, what no one discovered until after his death, was that sometime between 1933 and 1952, Robert Schultz's mechanical modifications had been discovered and enhanced by someone who understood their significance. The truth about the Farmall's hidden value emerged 3 months after Bill Williams's funeral, when Danny decided to rebuild the engine that had been giving him trouble since inheriting the machine. Danny had grown frustrated with the Farmall's rough running and oil consumption, and he'd finally decided to invest in a complete engine overhaul. It would cost more than the tractor was worth, but Danny had developed a sentimental attachment to the machine, and he knew his father would have approved of keeping it running. The revelation came when Danny pulled the cylinder head and discovered that the engine wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. "This is weird," Danny told his friend Mike Peterson, who helped him with the disassembly. "This engine block has casting numbers that don't match what should be in a 1952 Super C." Further investigation revealed that the Farmall's engine wasn't original International Harvester equipment. Instead, it was a carefully modified Ford Flathead V8, adapted to fit the Farmall's transmission and hydraulic systems through a custom-engineered adapter plate that showed unmistakable signs of professional machining. "Danny," Mike said, studying the engine components laid out on the workbench, "I don't think this is some farmer's backyard modification. This is precision engineering. Someone who really knew what they were doing built this engine." Danny photographed the engine components and sent the images to Tom Sullivan, a vintage tractor expert who wrote for several collector magazines and maintained an extensive database of rare and modified agricultural equipment. Sullivan's response came back within hours. "Call me immediately. I think you might have something very special there." The phone conversation that followed changed Danny's understanding of both his inheritance and his family's history. "What you're describing," Sullivan explained, "sounds like it might be one of the Ford Farmall conversion tractors that were built in the early 1950s by Ford's experimental division." Henry Ford had a personal interest in agricultural machinery, and he authorized a small project to develop high-performance versions of popular farm tractors using Ford automotive engines. Sullivan explained that fewer than 20 of these conversion tractors were ever built, and most were thought to have been scrapped decades ago. The project had been kept secret because it represented a potential competitive threat to Ford's own tractor manufacturing division, and the company had decided not to pursue commercial production. "If your tractor is authentic," Sullivan said, "it's not just rare, it's historically significant." Henry Ford's personal mechanic, a man named Gustav Eriksson, supervised the conversion work, and each tractor was essentially a hand-built prototype. Sullivan arranged to visit the Williams farm the following weekend to examine the Farmall in person. What he found exceeded his expectations. Not only was the engine a genuine Ford conversion, but the tractor had been maintained and modified over the decades by people who understood its significance. Someone had upgraded the electrical system to 12 volts, installed a modern carburetor that improved fuel efficiency and power output, and reinforced the transmission to handle the additional horsepower. Most importantly, Sullivan discovered documentation hidden inside the tractor's toolbox that had been sealed for over 60 years. The papers included the original Ford Motor Company work order for the conversion, signed by Gustav Eriksson himself, along with detailed specifications for the engine modifications, and a letter from Henry Ford's secretary indicating that the tractor had been built for evaluation purposes in agricultural applications. "Danny," Sullivan said, his voice filled with excitement, "this isn't just a rare tractor. This is a piece of American industrial history. Henry Ford's experimental agricultural division only exists in a few corporate records and some fuzzy photographs. This machine is physical proof of that program." The documentation also revealed something else that stunned everyone involved. The original owner of the converted Farmall had been Robert Schultz of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the same man who had sold the tractor to Thomas Williams in 1933. The connection hadn't been coincidental. Schultz had specifically sought out Ford's experimental division after leaving his job at the Henry Ford Museum, hoping to create agricultural equipment that combined International Harvester's field-proven designs with Ford's automotive engineering expertise. When Schultz's farming venture failed during the Depression, he'd sold the tractor without revealing its unique history, perhaps hoping to protect Ford from potential legal complications if the conversion became publicly known. The financial implications of Sullivan's authentication were staggering. "Collectors have been searching for these Ford Farmall conversions for decades," Sullivan explained. "Most people assumed they were destroyed or lost, a documented running example with this kind of provenance. I couldn't even estimate its value." Sullivan contacted 3 major collector car and tractor auction houses to get preliminary appraisals. The estimates ranged from $175,000 to $250,000, with some experts suggesting that the right buyer might pay significantly more for such a unique piece of automotive and agricultural history. Danny Williams' worthless inheritance was potentially worth more than his brother's John Deere by a factor of 8 to 1. But the story's most remarkable aspect wasn't the financial revelation. It was the discovery that Bill Williams had known about the tractor's significance all along. Ruth Williams provided the final piece of the puzzle when Danny shared Sullivan's findings with the family. "Your father figured this out about 10 years ago," she revealed. "He'd been doing some research on your grandfather Thomas, trying to put together a family history, when he came across some old bank records from the 1930s. He found the receipt for that tractor purchase and started investigating. Bill had contacted Ford's corporate archives and eventually connected with automotive historians who were researching Henry Ford's agricultural experiments. Through that network, he'd learned about the experimental tractor program and realized that his utility tractor might be connected to that history. He spent 2 years researching it," Ruth continued, "exchanged letters with historians, tracked down old Ford Motor Company records, even contacted the Henry Ford Museum. When he finally confirmed what he had, he was so proud he could barely contain himself. But Bill had chosen to keep the discovery secret, even from his own sons. He said he wanted to leave you boys something that would teach you about the value of things that aren't obvious," Ruth explained. "Marcus, he knew you'd appreciate the John Deere because you understand good equipment and proper maintenance. But Danny, he wanted you to learn that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that don't look like much on the surface." Bill's plan had been for Danny to discover the Farmall's significance through his own mechanical work and research, just as Bill himself had discovered it through historical investigation. "Your father always said that Danny had the best mechanical instincts in the family," Ruth said. "He knew that sooner or later you'd dig into that engine and figure out that something wasn't right. He wanted you to have the experience of making that discovery yourself. The revelation transformed not only Danny's understanding of his inheritance, but his relationship with his father's memory. Bill Williams hadn't given his younger son a consolation prize. He'd given him a treasure hunt that required exactly the kind of curiosity, mechanical skill, and historical interest that Danny had always demonstrated. Dad knew I'd take that engine apart, Danny realized. He knew I wouldn't be satisfied with leaving it the way it was. He was counting on me being stubborn enough to dig deeper. The Farmall's authentication also led to several unexpected developments. First, the Henry Ford Museum expressed strong interest in acquiring the tractor for their permanent collection, offering a price that exceeded even the highest auction estimates. Second, Ford Motor Company's current management, learning about the rediscovery of one of their founders' experimental tractors, invited Danny to participate in a documentary about Henry Ford's lesser-known innovations. Third, the International Harvester Collectors Association awarded Danny their annual Outstanding Discovery recognition for uncovering such significant agricultural equipment history. But perhaps most importantly, the revelation brought Marcus and Danny closer together as they worked to research and document their family's connection to this remarkable machine. "I have to admit," Marcus told his brother, "I was feeling pretty good about getting Dad's John Deere, but what you've got there is something special. That's not just a tractor, that's a piece of American innovation." The brothers decided to keep the Farmall in the family, with Danny continuing to maintain and occasionally operate it, while both brothers shared in the responsibility of preserving its historical significance. They also made a surprising decision about Marcus's John Deere. "You know what?" Marcus said 6 months after the Farmall's authentication. "Dad's 4050 is a beautiful machine, but it's just one of thousands that were built exactly the same way. What you've got is the only one like it in the world." Marcus proposed that they trade tractors, allowing Danny to have both the historically significant Farmall and a reliable modern machine that could handle contemporary farming tasks. But Danny declined the offer. "Marcus, I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing when he divided these tractors the way he did. You got the machine that represents the pinnacle of practical farming technology. I got the machine that represents innovation and the willingness to try something completely different." Danny's decision reflected his growing understanding of their father's intentions. "Dad wasn't being unfair when he split up the inheritance," Danny explained to his wife Sarah. "He was giving each of us something that matched our personalities and interests." Marcus needed a dependable, valuable piece of equipment that would serve him well in farming. I needed a puzzle to solve and a connection to family history that I didn't even know existed. The Farmall Super C continued to run, though Danny now operated it with a much deeper appreciation for its significance. He'd completed the engine overhaul using modern techniques that preserved the original Ford modifications while improving reliability and performance. More importantly, the discovery had inspired Danny to research other pieces of equipment in his father's collection, leading to the identification of several other historically significant machines that had been hiding in plain sight. Dad was a collector without knowing it, Danny realized. He had an eye for equipment that was special, even when he didn't understand why it was special. The story of the Ford Farmall conversion spread throughout the vintage tractor community, inspiring other owners of unusual or modified equipment to investigate their machines' histories more thoroughly. Several previously unknown experimental tractors were identified as a result of the publicity surrounding Danny's discovery, suggesting that the agricultural equipment market contained more hidden treasures than anyone had imagined. Tom Sullivan wrote an extensive article about the Williams family Farmall for Antique Power magazine, which became one of the publication's most popular features and helped establish Danny as an expert on modified vintage agricultural equipment. What makes this story remarkable, Sullivan wrote, isn't just the rarity of the machine itself, but the fact that it remained in active use for over 80 years while its significance went unrecognized. It's a reminder that agricultural history is still being written and that some of our most important artifacts are still out there, disguised as ordinary farm equipment. But for Danny Williams, the most valuable aspect of his discovery wasn't the financial windfall or the historical recognition. It was the deeper connection to his father and grandfather that the research had revealed. "I always knew Dad was smart about farming," Danny reflected, "but I never realized how much he understood about history and innovation. Finding out about this tractor made me see him in a completely different way. The inheritance that had initially seemed unfair had become a gift that kept giving, not just in terms of financial value, but in terms of family connections, historical knowledge, and personal growth." Ruth Williams watched her son's newfound collaboration with satisfaction, knowing that her late husband's unconventional approach to estate planning had achieved exactly what he'd intended. "Bill always said that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property," she told her daughters-in-law. "It's the curiosity to keep learning and the wisdom to look for value in unexpected places." Today, Danny Williams operates a successful vintage tractor restoration business, specializing in rare and modified agricultural equipment. The expertise he developed while researching his father's Farmall has made him one of the most sought-after authorities on experimental farm machinery from the 1930s through the 1960s. Marcus continues to farm the family land, now with greater appreciation for the historical significance of the equipment that built American agriculture. He's become an advocate for preserving agricultural heritage and often speaks at farming conferences about the importance of understanding the innovations that shaped modern farming. The 1952 Farmall Super C, with its hidden Ford V8 engine, still sits in the Williams family barn, but it's no longer just a utility tractor. It's become a symbol of innovation, family legacy, and the truth that sometimes the most valuable inheritances come disguised as something ordinary. The tractor that seemed like the consolation prize became the crown jewel of a collection, and the inheritance that appeared unfair became the foundation for a deeper understanding of family history and agricultural innovation. Bill Williams had been right about his sons. Marcus needed the dependable John Deere to continue the family farming tradition, while Danny needed the mysterious Farmall to discover his own passion for agricultural history and mechanical innovation. Sometimes the most thoughtful gifts are the ones that don't make sense until you unwrap all their layers. And sometimes the greatest inheritance is not what someone leaves you, but what they inspire you to discover about yourself. If this story inspired you to look more closely at the seemingly ordinary things in your own life, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that value often comes disguised as simplicity. Because in farming, as in life, the most important qualities, reliability, innovation, and legacy, don't always come in the most obvious packages. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the best gifts are the ones that teach us something about ourselves we didn't know we needed to learn. See you in the next video.